So the medieval period is just a continuation of the Middle Ages. It picks up right where we were just discussing the Byzantines. A lot of people don't even make the distinction between one and another. But if you can read this down here through the subcaptioning, it says medieval Europe around 1100. The only reason that there's a Europe to begin with is because of one specific man named Charlemagne. That's French for Charles the Great. Charles Martel, who was at the time the patriarch of a wealthy, the Martel family in northern France, who happened to have been really close friends with the Pope at the time. Charlemagne was really ambitious. He was a very smart guy, even though he wasn't educated. He saw the value of education and really began to emphasize education reform throughout, well, what would become Europe. In order to make all of these reform, not only was it education reform, but spiritual reform, because before Europe existed, everything that you see on this map here was, well, at least everything from here over to about, well, down through there and then through here, was subject to feudalism. So you would have a very powerful king in an area. The king would have a bunch of land that would be divided into vassal states. Those vassal states would have a population of serfs, which were basically just yeoman farmers who would grow. They were subsistence farmers. They would grow everything they needed to survive, and anything that was extra belonged to the king. So if you were born a serf, you died a serf. There was very, very little, if absolutely no opportunity to move up in the classes. Like you were either upper class or you were at the very bottom, and there wasn't any mobility. Um, Charlemagne was at the top of this ladder, but still wasn't the biggest fan of feudalism in general. Being that he was really close friends with the Pope, he requested the Pope's blessing to conquer, well, Europe at the time, or what would become Europe. It wasn't all that difficult for him to do. He established an army, and being that there were so many smaller kingdoms, he wasn't fighting one big army, one big group of people. It was one smaller army after another smaller army after another smaller army. He would pick up new troops along the way. It wasn't terribly challenging for him, but that was also because he was a very good, very respected military leader. A lot of military leaders look back at the conquest of Charlemagne as really good examples of how to lead an army. In fact, Napoleon saw Charlemagne as one of his most prominent influences. But anyway, Charlemagne goes through pretty much everything that you see here, and he converts all of these people to Christianity. He says that the story is that he would go into a city and everyone would get baptized. Whether or not you survived the baptism was up to you. You know, they would find a river or something, and everyone would be baptized in the river. If you accepted Christ, then you get go back to your home, and now you're a Christian. And if you didn't accept Christ, then you would just be drowned. Like you would be sent to meet him. Um, I'm not sure if that was true or not, and there was a lot more violence than just people being drowned. But without Charlemagne doing that, without the unification of all of these people, then there would not have been one solid unit of people to defend against what would have been considered just an invasion by the Islamic Empire. The Pope, which at the time was actually in France. You see here, this is the joke amongst historians that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. You know, at this point in time, the Paris was the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. Didn't have very much to do at all with Rome, other than the fact that Rome was where Catholicism was originally invented, I guess is the word. Um, but it wasn't supposed to be a governing body, even though it absolutely was. It was an empire, even though it wasn't supposed to be. And the whole holy part is that uh, the Holy Roman Empire was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people who were otherwise just living their lives. But there's a lot of politics involved in that. So Charlemagne created a cohesive group of people in here that even though they might have spoken different languages, they had similar cultural practices now, and they shared the same religion. And that religion unified them underneath the authority of the Pope himself. The Pope was at the top of the Holy Roman food chain. You know, despite how things were laid out before, like there were no kings, there were no vassals, there was the Pope and there were archbishops, and there were bishop and cardinals, but everything was structured according to the clergy and not according to, well, we'll say politics in general. So moving along, it just basically shows how the icons progressed, and you see how this one's definitely more expressive than its predecessor here. In fact, a lot of people believe that this later version of this icon might have been a direct copy. They might have been sitting around looking at this as a reference and have developed this from that. But by this point in time, you've got centuries of a population knowing to look for certain attributes of these characters, of these figures, to be able to determine who they are. So you get a little bit more creativity. Early on, you had to be a little bit more strict with these things, but you get a bit more creative leeway here. Now, this Christ figure is almost identical, at least in regards to the content of the image, that you saw in that very first image with the Christ figure on the ceiling of the catacombs. But this one looks different stylistically. You still have your Christ figure with the halo, which means he's nimbed. He's got his alpha and omega, but this one has this sort of geometric idea standardization of his facial features. Everything is basically just drawn on top of his face like it's a paper cutout. That's it's characteristic of what's called Romanesque artwork. It's what developed from the earlier Byzantine style. It's just a geometric abstracted version of the human figure. And the reason that became so commonplace, there are a few reasons, but the most prominent one is that the artists during this time period were really, really uncomfortable with iconoclasm, and they didn't really know when it was going to become popular again. Because if it did, then all of a sudden they were really uncertain with morally and spiritually what it was okay for them to do. If idolatry comes back, which it would every couple hundred years, it would become popular again. I mean, iconoclasm, not idolatry. Idolatry was never okay. Iconoclasm was fashionable, once every couple hundred years. So when it would become popular, they really didn't know if they would be considered heretics if they were creating these graven images. So they would abstract them to the point where they didn't seem to be devoted to capturing any real likeness. It's more about conveying the image or telling the story, creating the narrative in itself, which is also why the sense of perspective on this book is just bizarre. It's just not even close. They didn't want it to be too close because too close is dangerous. So moving on, skip that one. Let's talk about this very quickly. Now what you're looking at, this is still technically Romanesque architecture, even though it's a very unflattering version. This is a fortress. That fortress is composed of a castle, supporting structures, and this defensive wall. Around this wall are all of these little outcroppings here. These outcroppings are called buttresses. It's an important word to know, buttress. Those buttresses are basically it's dead weight that's leaning up against these walls to keep the walls from collapsing or falling over. We're going to see a different evolution of buttress in the next section when we discuss Gothic architecture. But for right now, just know that this is a buttress. And you can tell these things are for defensive purposes. Like if you have to worry about a neighboring kingdom just wandering in and invading you, you're going to have as much protection as possible. You see how deep this moat is? There's another one right here. And there's no moat on that side, but that's because it's surrounded by a vast body of water. So there's one less side to defend there. So definitely for defensive purposes. Kind of reminds me of the citadels when we were discussing Greek culture. Palace Chapel of Charlemagne. This is where Charlemagne was buried, and I believe it might have also been where he was coronated by the Pope. What I think is most interesting about this is that you still see exactly what you'd expect to find in a Romanesque structure. You've got your arches, and you've got columns, and you've got smaller arches inside of that big arch, and you've got columns supporting that. But this stylistic preference of light space, light stone, dark stone, light stone, dark stone in the archway itself, I believe is borrowed very specifically from Muslim culture, where stylistically this had been popular for a while. This is the Great Mosque of Cordoba in Spain. It's very, very common to find this patterning. in the Muslim architecture of the time. So you can see where one instance after another instance, there's this exchange of cultural influence between the Christians and the Muslims. That's because they were so close to one another. They're just rubbing shoulders a lot. All right, the Gero crucifix. This is one of the most interesting parts of medieval history to me, because it stands in opposition to a lot of what we have expected to find in our Christ figures up to this point. Two specific ways. One, this is a very dark-skinned Christ figure. I guess at some point somebody pulled out their map and determined that that Apollo reference that they'd been using that whole time really didn't have anything to do with what the Christ figure really would have should have looked like. And the National Geographic actually did a reconstruction based on the Aramaic people and the exact profession and place that Christ was from, and he looks absolutely nothing like the Christ figure that we're used to seeing. Google that if you're interested. It's very interesting. It doesn't look anything like what even not even what we're looking at here. Anyway, not only is this a dark-skinned Christ figure, but this is a very non-heroic version of a crucifixion. This looks like some regular guy with kind of a paunch belly here. He's not overly muscular. He's very dead, you know. He's not really acting in defiance of anything at the moment. And there's a really interesting thing that begins to happen in the church around this time, and that they begin to emphasize the church as a structure and the Virgin Mary more so than they pay attention to the gospel and Jesus. Like the two of those things are related. They say that the gospel itself is related, the word of Christ is related to the body of Christ, and the body of the church is related to the Madonna figure itself. That's why there's so many churches in France that are called Notre Dame. Like Notre Dame de Paris is just the one that everybody sees on the postcard and they, made the Disney movie about. But there are churches all over France. They're named Notre Dame. There are churches all over Europe that are referred to as some form of Our Mother, which is what Notre Dame means. And Our Mother is a reference to the Madonna figure, to the Virgin Mary herself. Um, Now, where that becomes specifically evident here is not just in the fact that Jesus has been humanized. He's no longer this superhuman figure. He's a regular guy, but you could also just completely pry him off of this just magnificent landmark cross that you have here, and you still have a hell of an icon to work with here. Even the halo that you see here, the halo, it definitely is Christ's halo, but if you take him off, it looks perfectly appropriate on a crucifix all by itself. Now, the crucifix in itself is another tangent. Romans didn't leave a manual for how they crucified people, but most people believe that this would have been much, much, much more common than this, even though this is how it's conveyed today. Um, they use lashing in this particular representation, but it wasn't unusual for them to use really long nails and drive them through the joints and the bones. But having this extension above what would be the capital T, what makes it a lowercase t with a little p sticking up at the top, a lot of historians today believe that that was something that became necessary when it became, well, you have to put the INRI, here lies the King of the Jews. That sign is necessary, and you want to be able to see that. The problem is, if you put that behind him here, the sign isn't legible. Even if you have him nailed across like that and have the sign over his head here, it's still not all that evident. So for a while, when they would make these crucifixion paintings, they would have this heavy cross and then a little stick with a sign on it that's just sort of up here somewhere. And eventually they realized that just looked weird, so they extended the cross upward further, and then you have this sign nailed to what would become this really majestic looking lowercase t that you see here. It's been gilded. Like, there is absolutely no need to have a crucifix this size to hold one single body. A lot of people say that it's symbolic of not the weight of the man, but the weight of the action of the crucifixion, the spiritual gravity of it, more so than the actual physical weight of the figure himself, which sort of again like re-emphasizes the spiritual. The spiritual is far more significant than the figurative, than the actual here. So we'll just stop there.